So it's good to see you all here. Thanks for being here. A few thank yous first. First, thank you to Baruch for hosting us again. Special thanks to Hans and Victor and Oliver for doing all the video and setting up all the details, and to our caterers who are taking such good care of us. A special thank you to Anna Josephson, my assistant. Anna's been taking your reservations and taking care of all the details for today, so I want to thank her very much. So we have a film to start the program out with. The film is called Justice by Design, and it is by Public Square Media, the same folks who brought you Rikers and American Jail. And Colby Kelly is here, and Brian Silva from Public Square Media. I want to thank them for putting these films together. Certainly the Rikers film had a real impact on the conversation around closing Rikers, and this film is also having an impact as a jumping off point for conversation about all the issues that we need to now face as we close Rikers. So thank you for doing the film, and thank you for providing it to all of us free of charge. We appreciate it. So could we just give a hand to Public Square Media? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start the film. One of our panelists isn't here yet, but I want to get going so we can get to the panelists, and then I'll come back with a brief opening statement, and then we'll get right to our conversation. I don't know who's doing this part. You are. Okay. Oh, and I want to say one, I forgot. Francis Greenburger. Thank you very much. That's kind of a, so for sponsoring this event, thank you, Francis. Great. Thank you. Oops, sorry. It's okay. Thank you so much.
God, please bless this food. Please help those who can't help themselves. Please guide us. Please point us in the right direction.
One of the biggest hopes that I have for my daughter is for her to understand that she is not defined by my incarceration.
Thank you for everything. Amen.
Amen.
The last time I was arrested, I had just turned 21 years old. My daughter at the time was 2 days old. I was arrested for robbery and sent to Rikers Island. The minute that I walked through that door, it just smelled like death and Lysol. The cells are very cold, dirty, there's insects and rodents, living conditions that we probably wouldn't allow our pets to live in.
You're absolutely overwhelmed by the absolutely putrid smell that exists all the time. There's no ventilation, there's no fresh air, there's no clean water. It's really a hard place to work, absolutely, and it's an even harder place to live.
On any given day, some 8,000 New Yorkers are held in jail, the large majority at Rikers Island. About 3/4 of them are simply awaiting their day in court.
Rikers Island is a jail. Most of the people who are on Rikers Island have not been found guilty of any crime yet.
4 out of 5 of them are in because they're pre-trial, they're presumed innocent. The vast majority of those have bail set, which means they just can't make bail.
40% of the population on Rikers Island has a mental health concern, right? Many of the people on Rikers Island are homeless.
Dramatically people of color. It's stunningly black and brown when you go into the place. Disparities are rampant.
The Rikers Island jail complex contains 8 of the city's 11 jails. It sits apart from the city, surrounded by the waters of the East River.
There's only one way on Rikers Island. We call it the Rikers Island Bridge. You have to go across that bridge in order to get to Rikers Island. There's no way to get there other than that.
Each year, tens of thousands of detainees cross this bridge. What happens to them and their families on the other side can have devastating consequences.
Even for the folks detained on Rikers Island, even for just a week, it disrupts your life. Right, you can lose your job just from being detained for a week or 2 on Rikers Island.
It's isolated. It's hard for staff to get to. Lawyers don't want to go there because it sucks up a whole day to ask a 15-minute question. Family members have felt humiliated in their experiences getting there and back.
You have to get to Rikers Island, You have to get across the bridge. You have to get to the control building. You have to wait to be processed through the visit. And then you have to wait for your visit. This could take hours, 4 or 5 hours.
Pamela Drayton made that journey many times while her son Lamont was held on Rikers.
He was there for about 3 years while he was going through his trial. Those visits are very important because it gives them a sense of being human, because they're not treated like human beings. They're not.
In 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice found systemic abuse and violation of detainees' constitutional rights at Rikers Island. The city was ordered to dismantle the violence-plagued culture.
The universal language on Rikers Island is violence. Even as a 16-year-old, I had to learn to speak the language very quickly.
The culture for the detainees and some of the correction officers is absolutely kill or be killed.
Correction officer told me, go get a knife like everyone else. So even if you didn't have a proclivity for violence before you went to Rikers Island, you will when you get there.
Oftentimes people on Rikers will tell you that the one thing everyone who leaves with is a sense of how to be a better criminal, not how to be a better citizen.
Many describe their worst time in jail as the days they travel to court.
You have to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to see a judge at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
You're a 19-year-old kid locked up at Rikers, and you're going to court not infrequently. Get handcuffed, hand and foot with a bunch of other young men, get put on a bus, get taken to court.
New York City spends $42 million a year transporting detainees to court throughout the 5 boroughs, where they sit shackled for hours, waiting for their case to be called, if it is called at all.
People take plea bargains just because they don't want to be handcuffed all day.
It's just awful, just the trauma, the sleep deprivation, the poor food, the stresses of being moved, and you're afraid, and you're going through a horrible experience.
At minimum, we're just supposed to have a constitutional level of decency for the people in our environment.
When do we get to a place where we treat people so inhumanely, in order to hold them accountable?
I spent almost 11 months at Rikers. Rikers Island should be closed. Rikers Island actually should have been closed decades ago. It is an inhumane environment.
The movement to close Rikers Island has gained momentum in the last decade through the efforts of activists and dozens of criminal justice reform organizations, including Just Leadership USA.
New York City, the mayor, the communities have an opportunity to say, we're going to disrupt and dismantle this culture, and we're going to rebuild a healthy culture for correctional guards and individuals who are incarcerated.
In 2017, Mayor Bill de Blasio made a historic announcement.
New York City will close the Rikers Island jail facility.
The jail population has declined every single year since its peak in 1991. It never went back up. It always has been going down. And during that time, crime in New York has always been going down.
Criminal justice reforms like supervised release, bail relief programs, and a reduction in arrests have all reduced the jail population.
We dropped below 8,000 right around the end of 2018 for the first time since 1980. And the hope is to get down to 5,000 before Rikers closes down.
The plan is to replace the 8 jails on Rikers with 4 new community-based facilities. 3 will be built on existing jail sites already located near courthouses.
By splitting people up into the jails that are next to their courthouses, you not only make it easier for them to attend their trial, which can in and of itself be a really traumatic day for a lot of people on Rikers, but you also make it so that their families can visit.
When individuals can receive family visits, what you're doing is that you are continuing to strengthen the bond between the individual and family, and you increase the chances of this person really being productive in that community.
The main benefit of me serving time in a community-based correctional facility was the ability to still be connected to my family.
The local facility in Ohio, where Deanna Hoskins served time, focuses primarily on rehabilitation and reentry.
This program was totally different from just custody and control. To start, what are the things that you need specifically for reentry? How do we ensure that you return to our community a better person than when you went in?
New facilities around the country offer examples of how jail design has evolved since Rikers was built. Architects now understand how better floor plans can improve detention culture and reduce violence. 30 miles north of the city, Westchester County replaced an old-style jail with a newer model of correctional housing.
It's very disconcerting for somebody to go from living in the community to being in a traditional linear cell block where you have bars. This is what we call direct supervision housing.
The whole notion of direct supervision creates a safe environment between the detainees and between staff and detainee, because it's all based on human relations. People are talking to each other.
The officer is embedded right within the housing unit, and programming and other services come right up onto the block. Whether it's nursing, mental health, education, legal services, we want to do all of that right within the housing area. So it's a safer and more community-based environment for staff and offender.
You were engaged with the custody staff that was there. They were a part of the program. They didn't sit in a booth or behind glass. They sat at a desk right there in the middle of the day area where you were.
The borough jail plan calls for expanding and improving this direct supervision model that is already being used in some facilities at Rikers.
And not surprisingly enough, it works. If you treat people like human beings, they'll behave like human beings.
It's not only about space, and that's a huge issue, but you have to change the culture. If you don't change the size of the jail, the culture, and also address the community safety issues. One of the things that the commission that I'm on has been doing is really enforcing that we really need to look at culture, change culture, and ensure that these issues are addressed.
Alethea Taylor serves on the Culture Change Working Group for the new borough jails.
Mm-hmm. There's more than that. There has to be a culture at the Department of Corrections of change. And not all, there's this premise that all corrections officers are the same, and they're not. But there is a culture of violence at Rikers, but not only for the staff, it's for inmates, it's for a lot of people, and that has to change. It can't be that we are just moving buildings, then we'll have small little Rikers in different communities.
I've met officers who behave one very difficult and frustrating way in one facility and completely change their ways in a whole nother facility because the culture is not there. So creating new borough-based jails gives us an opportunity to actually affect culture.
Johnny Perez is the director of the U.S. Prisons Program for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture.
The biggest influencer in allowing me to make better decisions in my life was education. It just so happened that I discovered education while incarcerated.
Today's group, right, is going to be job readiness.
The mayor has already mandated a minimum of 5 hours a day of programming to address educational, vocational, and therapeutic needs.
Maybe in some cases, it may be the ideal job.
The inmates should have the programs. If we expect people to come back to the community better than when they left, then of course we should provide them with training. We should educate them.
To fill in the gap of where you want to get at and where you are.
Rikers is incredibly frustrating and difficult for anyone who's really trying to do good work.
The facilities themselves are so completely wrong in so many ways, but the programs that are being operated there are extraordinary.
She taught me how to put myself in a position to think positive.
Positive thinking, self-affirmation, that's what they say.
In addition to better programming space, the new plan envisions a healthier living environment with sunlight and fresh air more akin to the outside world.
Certainly, the presence of natural materials is something that makes environments feel more normal. Everyone has their own sleeping room. There's a common day room where people have their meals and participate in group activities. There's a recreation area off of every housing unit, providing the ability to go outside and get fresh air without having to wait to get your 1 hour once a week or whatever. Is there science behind this? Absolutely. Creating environments that are normal, that are calm, produces better behaviors.
Not only does the new plan call for improved conditions for both detainees and guards, it also proposes neighborhood amenities like community meeting space and ground floor retail.
It's a part of the community where it sits. It becomes an asset to the community, but the community has to have a role in what the needs are and what is actually available to them in their community.
I'm not one of those guys that thinks that physical plant means everything, that the buildings save you. You can run a lousy jail in a good building, but gee, it's nice to have a good building, and it's really humiliating for the staff and for the people who are incarcerated there to be in such a decrepit environment.
The large majority of people held on Rikers Island are not sent on to prison, but return to their neighborhoods after their stay in jail.
I think we all would think that going into a prison or a jail is traumatic. I don't think we necessarily think that coming out of those institutions is as traumatic as going in. But for people who are coming home to uncertainty, it's extremely traumatic.
Wesley Keynes works for a public defender nonprofit in the Bronx, helping people confront the challenges of coming home. He knows firsthand what that's like.
I'm still in my reentry process, right? And it's been several years. Whether or not someone is able to navigate that process is really dependent on the support that they have. Reentry should begin when the handcuffs were placed on someone.
Once a person enters Rikers Island, it costs taxpayers an estimated $828 for every day they're detained there.
If we are going to spend a lot of money dealing with people whose freedom we have taken away, they should leave the institution better than when they came in, not worse.
I'm flabbergasted by the concept of, of corrections, right? The idea that the worse that I treat you, the more that's going to make you change and not come back here, not knowing that only exacerbates the problem.
We should make the environment as normalized as possible because they're going to come back out into our neighborhoods, and we want them to be as normal as possible, in part, but also because it's the decent and right thing to do.
The plan to close Rikers Island and create new borough-based jails presents a unique opportunity to ask, what should justice by design look like?
When I think about what justice by design means to me, is a justice system designed by and for individuals who are formerly incarcerated. It's designed by those closest to the problem, being closest to the solution, to have a voice in what this looks like.
It means thinking through all of the stakeholders and all of their needs, absolutely with safety being one of them, but also with therapy and with rehabilitation, hopefully being at the forefront.
Part of it is improving conditions and culture so that we don't humiliate and degrade people. Part of it is help individuals so that they can move beyond the challenges that brought them into the prison system.
And think about how many more ways those tax dollars could be used to advance both public safety and more services if it was not wasted in a system that really just dehumanizes and creates a cycle of people going in and out of cages.
I don't know too much about you and Mommy's relationship. I never got to experience y'all together, so that's why we wanted to know.
For a lot of years, I saw my daughter grow up through pictures. Today, she's 18, going on 50.
Who told you to say that?
She was the first person to forgive me when I came home.
You ever feel like you just want to get away?
She said, Dad, I want you to know that I don't care what happened and I'm glad that you're here now.
So I guess
She's also taught me a lot about compassion and second chances. And my hope is to try to bring humanity back into this entire conversation. That we can design spaces where justice is not only present, but also guaranteed.
Thank you again to Public Square Media for that film. It's very helpful. What Justice by Design means for the Greenburger Center is really not so much about the physical design of the structures, but it is very much about the redesign of the mental health system. That we are talking today about an After Rikers is a testament to many of the people who are in this room and some who are not. Today is possible because advocates, both grassroots and grass tops, pushed on government decision makers from the outside to change the system on the inside. And now it's time to change the inside. Decision makers have the opportunity to redesign more than just jails or structures. They have the chance to redesign systems. But it's not enough to change the criminal justice system. The Closed Rikers and After Rikers movements must now force change on the mental health system too, because incarceration or mass incarceration has not only been about the over-incarceration of people with substance use disorders, people of color, and poor people. It has very much been about the mass incarceration of people with mental illness. So far, most of our collective attention has focused on locating and redesigning jails, with much attention paid to the needs of the criminal justice system. And while at first glance that makes some sense to make sure that the people who are incarcerated and those who guard them are safe, the reality is an ever-growing percentage of the jail population has mental illness, substance use disorders, or the condition no one likes to talk about, so-called personality disorders. In a war where at least half the population in jail has mental illness and some 16 to 20% have serious mental illness, where thousands have personality disorders and substance use disorders, and also physical health conditions, focusing primarily on the physical design of new jails starts to look at least unworkable. Because trying to incarcerate our way out of a failed mental health system and a self-created drug war is unworkable. Simply put, the framework society has chosen to treat mental illness and substance use disorders is the wrong framework. DAs, police, correction officers are not mental health professionals. One might ask, and I will today, so where have mental health professionals been these last 40 years as their most ill patients have been criminalized? And while that is an important question, ultimately, the criminalization of people with mental illness has happened on our collective watch. We have all been perpetrators. I guess you could say we've all been complicit. For me, that is why the Closed Rikers movement was so important and why what's happening in LA is groundbreaking. For those of us who work at the intersection of mental health and criminal justice, we knew from the start that the call to close Rikers would necessarily and finally end with a conversation about the criminalization and mass incarceration of people with mental illness, because they are the ones who are left. So we're here today at a crossroads. New York City has the opportunity, and I would say responsibility, to set the stage not only for criminal justice reform, but mental health reform too for the next 50 years. The decision to close Rikers cracked wide open the criminal justice system here in New York, and as the fault line spread, it exposed the failings of our mental health system too. But until recently, the city seemed to have limited their thinking about what to do with the SMI or seriously mentally ill population to whether special mental health units should be placed in one or all four of the new city-based jails. For the last year, I have been saying, asking whether to put the SMI population in one or four of the city-based jails is the wrong question. It's not one or four, it's none. A few weeks ago, LA showed us the way toward treatment and not punishment. While I'm encouraged that the plans here in New York are underway to move the SMI population and others off of the island into treatment facilities, I am concerned that these treatment facilities will still be jails, will still be controlled by the criminal justice system instead of the mental health system. We need a new framework, one where, while we still may need some jail capacity, for many, if not most of the people with serious mental illness, substance use disorders, and even for those with personality disorders, our money and morality would be better spent on facilities designed in conjunction with and run by people in the mental health profession, whose goal is to stabilize, treat, and where necessary, rehabilitate folks to their care and then step them down into the community. So today we're going to explore these issues with our panelists. We have Liz Glazer here from the city to tell us about the city's latest thinking. We have Mark Anthony Johnson, who came out from LA to tell us about how LA took a different path. Homer Ventners is here to tell us about the reality of treating people with mental illness in jails. And Jeff Regaler will tell us what his members at the American Psychiatric Association can do to help as well change the framework. And finally, we have a late addition and very welcome Elizabeth Ford, Dr. Ford from City Health and Hospital Corporation is here to tell us the very latest on both developments off and on Rikers. So I'm going to ask our panelists to come up and take seats, and then we'll have a conversation with them, and then we are going to have time for question and answers from the audience. This is really designed to be a conversation. And I'm going to ask the first question to Dr. Geller, but I do want to call out Liz first, not only because she has to leave, but because my experience, especially the last 5 years with Hope House, trying to create something new is really difficult. And it's, I think, a lot easier to tear something down. And while tearing Rikers down was extremely difficult, and the good news is that they were successful, the bad news is what comes next is probably harder. And that's fallen onto your shoulders. And I just want to acknowledge that it might be difficult today to have this conversation, but I have always found that you are so open to conversation and even criticism and open to new ideas. So I just want to thank you for being here on behalf of the administration.
Sure. Well, my time is now done. I'll
Yeah.
be on my way.
Well, not so fast.
But I would just say, just in response to that, I actually see it as this enormous opportunity for the city and for everybody in this room and beyond to completely rethink and redo how we do jail. And that's why it's so exciting, and it builds on some really fundamental work that's been happening due to many, many, many people.
Yeah, well, thanks, and thanks for being here. So Dr. Geller, in May, you are taking over in 2020 of the American Psychiatric Association, and it has 37,000 members. I think it's the largest organization in the world of that nature, right?
Correct.
So you also run a large public psychiatric hospital in Massachusetts with about 290 beds. So I want to set the stage for the conversation and have you talk about the difference between serious mental illness and personality disorder, because I think it's important to the conversation. So could you talk about that, and then talk about how many of your patients have SMI as opposed to personality disorder?
Serious mental illness is a term that's used in psychiatry. It's also a term that's used in some states in their state statutes to specify who or who will not get certain services. It's generally agreed upon that serious mental illness includes individuals who have schizophrenia, who have schizoaffective disorder, who have severe bipolar disorder, and who have severe major depressive disorder. In some states, other disorders are included, such as obsessive compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, autistic spectrum disorder, and panic disorder. The Center for Mental Health Services, which is one of the divisions of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, defines serious mental illness as having a DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, diagnosis of mental illness that results in a functional impairment that substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that the number of Americans that fit that definition of serious mental illness is 5.3% of the population. 1.1% have schizophrenia, 2.2% have severe bipolar disorder, and 2% have severe major depressive disorder. Now, personality disorder is defined in the current DSM, that's DSM-5, as follows: an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of an individual's culture, with manifestations in at least two of the areas: cognition, that is how you see yourself, how you see others, how you see events; affect, that's variables in terms of the range of your affect, the lability, the intensity, and the appropriateness of it to the context; interpersonal functioning; and impulse control. These personality disorders are divided into clusters. Cluster A includes paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Cluster B antisocial personality disorder, which we'll hear a lot about today, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. And the third cluster, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders.
So I'm just going to ask you, thanks for that overview, but so there's been a lot of debate whether in a jail setting or in a treatment setting, whether you can treat these populations in the same facility and whether, in fact, someone with a personality disorder can be treated at all. And it seems to me that a large percentage of those in jails and in facilities actually have personality disorder. So can you just quickly respond to that?
And let me answer that in two parts. First is the easy treatment, and then the second is where should they be treated? So it's easier to treat serious mental illness than it is to treat personality disorders. And the reason is if you listen to the definition, it's an enduring pattern of inner experience of behavior. So the person identifies it. This is who I am. I'm like this. There's no medication that's going to treat that. There are therapeutic techniques. But if a person has a serious mental illness and they respond to, for example, an antipsychotic medication, then you have a person who is no longer psychotic and has a personhood that can function quite like many other people in society. There's many people who actually use some of their qualities of their personality disorders to their advantage, and some of them have made major contributions to our society. Beethoven, Benjamin Franklin, and Albert Einstein were three that had obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, the question is asked, where should people with serious mental illness be treated, and where should people with personality disorders be treated? And that treats the function as if it's a dichotomy, as if we have, well, this group with serious mental illness and this group with personality disorders. So let's just look at this. We have serious mental illness alone. That's your only diagnosis. We have personality disorder alone. That's two groups. Then we have people who have both. That's a third group. Then we have either with alcohol, either with substance abuse, either with cognitive disorders since birth, either with head trauma, either with early stages of dementia, either with severe medical illness like diabetes or COPD, and either with malingering. So we now have 17 groups that we're going to have to parse out. And that's only two. That is, these folks I've mentioned only have two disorders. How about if they have more than two disorders? And if I have a minute, could I give 3 cases, just briefly?
I think not, because we started late, and I want to ask Dr. Ford another question. So I guess briefly, can folks with more complicated personality disorders be treated in the same facility as those with SMI?
Okay.
Well, actually, I was going to ask Dr. But you know what? Let me move on. Dr. Ford, so you basically are responsible for all the mental health at Rikers and in the city's Health and Hospital Corporation. So can you tell us about the population at Rikers and what percentage has SMI, what percentage has personality disorders? How do you, if at all, treat them separately? So can you talk about that?
Sure, and hopefully we'll get back to the other question too.
Yeah.
That's important.
Right.
In the New York City jail system, there are about 1,100 or 1,200 people a day who have what the New York City jail system defines as serious mental illness. And to Dr. Geller's point, the definition of serious mental illness is different in almost every jurisdiction and healthcare facility where you go to in this country. So there isn't a standardized definition, which makes discussions about where everybody with serious mental illness should be or treated very difficult and challenging. We have defined it in the jail to mean anybody with schizophrenia spectrum disorder, so it doesn't necessarily have to be schizophrenia, anybody with bipolar spectrum disorder, so that also does not necessarily have to be severe bipolar 1 disorder, major depressive disorder, and we have included post-traumatic stress disorder in our definition of serious mental illness. We revised our definitions in 2017 because we felt it was extremely important to be as diagnostically accurate for the patients that we were seeing. And with respect, I do want to mention about the particular personality disorder antisocial personality disorder, because that is one that I think many people think may belong in jail or can't be treated in hospitals. And we diagnose antisocial personality disorder extremely rarely in our jail, because what you find when you ask people who have this purported diagnosis about their life experience, it is one of repeated and serious trauma over and over again. And what they're demonstrating is what we all see as a complex version of PTSD. And when you're in jail, which is traumatizing in and of itself, there's very little chance that lifetime of trauma is going to be improved in that setting. So I do think it's important to think about that. We have, a jail is a strange place to do treatment, and I'm not generally in favor of that, although I am in favor of trying to do the best you can in whatever setting you're in. But we have found that repeated, consistent, humanistic approaches that don't require medication with patients who have, quote, antisocial work in that jail setting. And unfortunately, in New York City, people are in jail for a long time, which also then sort of paradoxically affords us the advantage of time with which we can develop a relationship with these individuals. I don't believe antisocial and personality disorders generally are untreatable. I'm not sure psychiatry, and with all due respect, I don't think psychiatry as a science has gotten to its peak yet and has figured out how best to do it. But I do think that we have, over time, seen that particular population as one that either we don't want to treat or we don't know how to treat, or maybe we can't. And that essential mental health neglect has led to this population that is now really in our jail system.
So would you say they outnumber the folks with the SMI population, that we have to deal with this population?
Well, so the answer for New York City is probably going to be different from other locations, because again, we are picking up underlying trauma and diagnosing people with that rather than personality disorders.
I see.
And so our rates are going to be low. But I think in general, in the jail and prison systems in the country, there is a high prevalence of personality disorders.
So Homer, I'm going to go to you next and just jump off what Dr. Ford was talking about. You've also spent almost 10 years being the head chief medical officer at Rikers. And can you tell us about that experience, but specifically from that experience, do you think that a jail is a place that anyone with mental illness should be treated or can be treated successfully?
So I think that, and thanks for putting this together and the invitation. It's really an incredible convening this morning.
I think you need to move your mic up, Homer.
Yeah.
Up a little bit higher, maybe.
Right. I think that jail settings must be competent to provide evidence-based health care for everybody who comes there. It's not just a constitutional guarantee. It's something that, because we've carved health care in jails and prisons out of the rest of the nation's health care through a series of errors in the Social Security Act and other problems, the health care you get in jail and prisons is not overseen for quality or adequacy like it is if you go to the hospital or any mental health clinic, and should be, and the funding as well. But to this point about how to provide and what scope of services should be provided, I think we still are missing an important first step, which is transparency about what really happens to people behind jails. Every jail system in this country pretty much has gone through wave after wave after wave of improving conditions, of getting a better physical plant, about trying to reform. That is important, and closing Rikers is certainly required. But we still don't track and report to everybody some very basic data about how dangerous jails are. So how many people get injured and how many of those injuries are serious? How do we compare this jail to that? How many people who need an antipsychotic or who need a group or individual therapy session for any type of disorder are getting it, and how many aren't, and why isn't that happening? And then when those things don't happen, when there are preventable deaths, which we could also track and report, what are the consequences? We're stuck in this litigation mode, very, settlements that nobody knows about, so that before we, or as we think about reforming these systems, we must commit to transparency, because what will ultimately happen, it happens everywhere. Think about how many Department of Justice monitors have overseen just Rikers, let alone all the other jails and prisons in the country. We must commit to transparency about the health outcomes, the real health risks of these places, because having led the health service in the city jails, you know, we focused a lot on improving the care, right? This type of care, that type of care. We made great gains, and Dr. Ford really represents one of the most important. Her bringing like psychiatric excellence into our service was fantastic. But every system should, these are public institutions, they must report out what works and what doesn't, and then they must be held accountable in a way that a hospital would. If a hospital messes up and doesn't do a good job with cardiac catheterization or putting a cast on or putting an IV in, you know what happens? They lose their money, and they can't do that anymore. Our jail systems are just the opposite. They get sued, there's a settlement, they keep going, and that model, because we've hidden it away, is something we have to undo. But I think that you know, to the specific point, I think that our assumption should be people with serious mental illness, people with primarily health problems that led to their justice involvement, whether it's serious mental illness, whether it's a personality disorder, whether it's diabetes, and you can't pay for your test strips. Those people should not be detained and they shouldn't be in jail. And there will be exceptions, right? There will be people that slip through the cracks. There will be public safety concerns that are compelling or overwhelming. So every jail system has to have the competence to do evidence-based care. But a health problem shouldn't lead to your incarceration. And all of our solutions to this reform now, must be driven by that principle.
So Homer, who is responsible for reporting out that information? Would it be corrections? Why aren't we getting that information? Why aren't we getting that transparency?
We're farther along in New York City than many places, but you know, the Board of Corrections has a great report recently that we still have a big disconnect on like how many serious injuries occur. So jail systems should have oversight, every one of them. What is really a shame in this country is that who cares about health care outside of jails and prisons, right? Well, you have a state Department of Health, you have a county Department of Health, you have the CDC, you have the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and you have the Joint Commission for Hospitals. Just those institutions alone, it's a shame that they're not involved with what happens to healthcare in these systems. In this state, we're a little farther along because we have the Board of Correction, the State Commissioner of Correction. The Department of Health of this state cares for some reason about HIV and hepatitis C behind bars, right? They should care about all of it. It should be their job to do all of it. Every one of those institutions, if those are the best we have to guarantee the adequacy of care everywhere else, they should be involved in what happens behind bars.
So does it take legislation to fix that?
Yes.
Okay. State and city?
State, city, and federal.
Mark Anthony. So tell us about LA's decision to create a mental health center instead of a new men's jail, including your role in the process.
Awesome. Can y'all hear me? Thank you. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Mark Anthony Clayton Johnson. I am the founder of the Frontline Wellness Network. We're a network of healthcare providers who see incarceration as a public health crisis and have been working as an organizer in Los Angeles for probably the last 17 years. And you asked about this recent decision in Los Angeles to invest in treatment, and really the story has been an 8-year campaign led by formerly incarcerated people, folks who have loved ones that are incarcerated, to really change not only the narrative around who deserves care, who deserves treatment, but really trying to interrupt the idea that in order for people to get care, they have to have some type of criminal justice involvement. And so my work, this is really personal for me. A loved one of mine had been brutally beaten inside the county jail systems inside the 90s and was essentially tortured for about 2 weeks. And right around the time where Dignity and Power Now, my previous organization, had started in 2012, he went into a pretty serious episode. He is diagnosed with schizoaffective. And what was really striking to me about that moment is in the middle of that episode, a lot of what he was, quote unquote, hallucinating about was the ways in which he was being tortured. He imagined that people were the sheriffs. He imagined that my home, my living room, was actually the cell that they had kept him in and turned off his water, right? And so what really stood out for me is that violence actually doesn't stop when the beating stops or when the torture stops. Violence continues in many ways, and the level of imagination and the campaigns we have to wage to actually change infrastructure have to account for that level of violence and impact that incarceration has on our folks. And so over an 8-year period, Folks like myself, folks who have had loved ones inside, folks who've been incarcerated have waged a campaign to stop Los Angeles from spending $4 billion building 2 jails, one a mental health jail, which we from jump said was an oxymoron, and building a women's jail. And it took us a lot of work, a lot of grinding, and really in 2016, we essentially lost that fight. The county said we are going to move forward with this. There was a DOJ pressure that the county was feeling. The DOJ had come in and said, look, conditions are so bad, the jail system produces suicidality, and there's no way in which this current facility, Men's Central Jail, can really meet the mandates that the DOJ was putting on the county, and so this thing has to be torn down and something else has to be built. LA is already the largest jail system in the country. It's at about 17,000 people right now. And we were saying that, look, this is also the largest treatment facility in the country, this incarceration system that has been developed over many, many years and in many ways perfected. And so we actually have to change the paradigm. We have to actually shift away and use this as an opportunity to shift resources away from that. And so in 2016, what was really striking for me about that loss is that there was no organized healthcare provider response. There were no healthcare providers that were there saying, look, you're using a health analysis to advance this argument for jail construction, and that is a problem, right? And so my work over the last 18 months in particular has been to organize healthcare providers within the Justice LA coalition, which is a broad coalition across Los Angeles County. And I'm happy to say on February 12th, we had a pretty significant victory, which looked like several things. One was we were able to totally eliminate the plan to build a women's jail. We were able to stop the approval of the $4 billion mental health jail. In addition to that, the county agreed to actually redesign that contract so that the facility that was going to be built would be a treatment facility. And not only did we win the stoppage of the jails, but we also won the landscape. And what I mean by that is the sheriffs were actually written out of this process. So in fact, this facility will be run by DMH, by the Department of Mental Health, right? Probation is not involved in this thing. It's really DMH, DHS who will be running this thing. And so that was really huge for us. That was really, really important for us to name, that it wasn't just about stopping the jails, but it was about changing the landscape and redirecting $4 billion into treatment. And now we're in this moment where things have moved so fast that folks are actually trying to figure out, how do we do this? Like, what is this thing gonna look like? And it's been really exciting for us, because what we've been saying is you need to not build a central treatment monolith, right? The largest mental health hospitals in California are about 1,200, 1,300 beds. And there are issues with the way treatment shows up in those facilities. What's on the table right now is a 4,000 bed treatment facility, which we think is bound to fail. And so we've been saying, let's build community-based treatment centers, right? That are not run by sheriffs, they're not staffed by sheriffs, they're run by DMH, and that our folks can have more access to care. In addition to that, we're also running on other fronts, right? Because part of what's going to be really important is for us to see this as a decarceral moment. And so we're doing work around bail reform. We're doing work to really see some impact around pretrial reform to make sure that we're actually decarcerating the county jail system. About 47% of our jail population is pretrial, and at least 30% of the population of folks have some type of mental health condition. We think it's much more than that. And so we really want to have these conversations in a very intersecting way and talk about how community-based treatment can really lead towards decarcerating Los Angeles. And I would say the last piece of this that we're talking about is this isn't going to work unless we actually reduce police contact, unless we figure out the ways in which public health strategies can be used to reduce the amount of contact that folks are having with law enforcement on a daily basis. The top 5 reasons that people are arrested in Los Angeles are for reasons that we think can be solved using other strategies: DUIs, failure to appear in court, driving without a license, possessions of a narcotic, possessions of a controlled substance. Those are things that we actually feel like can be solved using community-based, non-carceral, non-law enforcement strategies. And over the next year, we really want to help design and push and invest in community-based solutions that can make that happen.
Thank you. So just a couple follow-ups. So, and you may not have the answers yet, but are there going to be any folks who will be prohibited from going into the treatment facilities? How do you think about providing security? Will it be fully a civil system? How will you transfer folks from a criminal system into a treatment system, and how will they be coming and going? I know.
Yeah, I mean, those are some of the questions, right? Those are some of the things that are being figured out. The reality is we don't actually know right now. And I think that's an exciting place to be in. It's also a really vulnerable place to be in, because one of the things that happens in this moment of really powerful opening is that folks start to ask the questions that really create a lot of political inertia. Like, what are you going to do about the most violent people? What are you going to do about the people who can't be treated? And what we've been saying is like, look, we want to have that conversation. I myself identify as someone who believes in abolition, who believes in thinking about public safety in ways that does not exist in the way that we think about it now. And part of what we've been saying is like, look, if you want to have the conversation around how to deal with the folks who are most violent, we want to have that too. But first of all, let's answer the question, how many people do you actually think that is? And most people can't tell you. We've sat down with the sheriff, and the sheriff said, I don't know. I don't know how many people actually need to be in this jail, right? And so until we get to that point, let's start to have these more politically charged conversations about what where the most violent person should be, or where the person who can't be treated should be. But we don't think we're actually in that moment. And if we get to just that baseline, we think the jail system will look radically different. And I think it will look like a thing where we can actually divert people out of the county jail system. I think what's really exciting about some of the things that are happening in LA right now is we have an Office of Diversion of Reentry that was created a few years ago that is just really picking up steam, is doing some really important work. And in one of the courts, you have a judge, you have physicians, you have the public defenders, and you have the DA who will say that this person who is being brought in, who has a violent charge ranging from assault with a deadly weapon to assault, has a serious mental illness, that the best solution for this person is to be diverted to community-based treatment. And so those things are being experimented with right now. And it's a very interesting moment. It's a very exciting moment, but it's also a politically vulnerable moment. And this is why we're calling on healthcare providers as well as other folks to help protect those type of pilots that really need to be scaled up right now.
Yeah, thank you. So Liz, can you bring us up to speed on where the city is right now with the diversion efforts? I know that there's been talk about these so-called outposted beds, moving the SMI population and others off the island. I know you probably can't get into a lot of details, but can you tell us what you can about the plans?
I would love to just make a quick comment.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, we want this to be a conversation. Yeah.
And this has been so fascinating and important, and I think has touched on crucial issues that we're all facing. And I think where we are at this moment in New York. Oh. Don't challenge me on left-right. I'm going to use this. Is this good? Okay. So I actually think where we are right now in New York City, and it sounds like in other jurisdictions across the country, is just a fundamental questioning of who needs to be in jail at all, and what is the purpose and function of jail. And so we talk a lot about Rikers, and we talk a lot about the population. I would just challenge this group to say, Rikers or a jail population just holds up a mirror to much more fundamental criminal justice reform. Who goes in, how long they stay, who's going to come back. Those are all things that a jail doesn't do. Other people make decisions about that. And it's not just judges and prosecutors and police. It's New Yorkers themselves who decide what the behavior is going to be like. And so what I would say is we have worked very hard in this city over the past 5 years and way before that. And the people in this room are the people who have done this to really molecularly understand who the criminal justice system is touching, who needs to or who is going into jail, and how do we reduce that. And so when we look over the past 5 years at what has happened to our jails, again, just thinking about jails as a trope for the entire not just justice system, but really for our society as a whole, we have seen the steepest decline that we've had in decades in this city. We're down 30% in the last 5 years in a very, very intentional way. Today, our rate of incarceration looks more like the United Kingdom than it does the rest of the nation. And we're almost at half the rate of incarceration that Los Angeles is. So that doesn't mean that the job is done by any means, but what I would say is all those questions that we've been asking and been using and all the analysis that we've been trying to do generally to reduce the jail population and to lighten the touch of enforcement, that's what we must do when we deal with issues of behavioral health. And I would say that it's, as Homer has said, and this will sound so wonky, but we cannot do that unless we understand what the data says. And there are hideous barriers to sharing data. Absolutely, you know, there are issues of privacy and stuff like that, but we need to be able to understand who are we looking at? What are the post-traumatic stress disorders? What's causing that even before jail? And then I think we need to be able to look at the whole array of issues that we're talking about when we think about behavioral health. Greenburger has done amazing work on the SMI population, but I think, as the doctor sort of pointed out, Dr. Geller, there are a gazillion different ways that this breaks up. Everything from, you know, people who are in and out of our jail system very, very quickly and hit many, many systems, shelter, criminal justice, our jails, to people who have substance use issues, and maybe that's alone or maybe that's in combination, to the seriously mentally ill. And how we address that inside or outside of jail is absolutely the work of the moment, and what I think we need to do. But it's happening in this much bigger context, which I think is really, really helpful to us, that is really sort of seeing this incredible sea change in the way in which New Yorkers are now receptive to some of these changes. And I'll just give you one fact that to me is heartening. So we've seen a 30% reduction in our jail population in the last 5 years, which is a pretty stunning reduction. Almost half of that is because we built, and there are providers here. I ran into a social worker in the elevator who was part of this, yes? Because we built alternatives, and because then, crucially, judges were willing to use it. And I think this issue, particularly when we get to behavioral health, of how we change the culture and willingness of judges and prosecutors and others to use services, and how we change the minds of New Yorkers so that it isn't scary to have a hospital, a jail, whatever it may be near them, is the absolute crucial runway to reform.
Thank you. It's interesting to me that it seems like New York has a lead on reducing the numbers. Your incarceration rate is down, and in the diversion programs, we have folks here who have been providing diversion for 20 years, and just, you know, Fortune and Osborne, just terrific. But LA is leading the way on the other side, and that is doing a huge leap to saying, no, we're not going to embed mental health units in the justice system. We're not going to continue that path. We're going to separate that out. And I just think the collaboration here is so important, and I'm so glad that,
yeah, and so much to learn from each other. And this is not to say that we have solved the problem at all. I don't mean to say that at all, although we are among New Yorkers.
Yeah.
much to learn, a steep hill, and really, really excited. We were talking earlier about much to learn from LA.
Okay, so you didn't answer the question, though, about the outposted beds. Yeah.
Oh, right. So just part of that steep hill and starting to kind of learn and figure these things out. And there are multiple different tracks. You know, not every single thing appears in the paper. What Cheryl's referring to is a couple of weeks ago, the city issued a solicitation to get some help from folks to begin to help us think about how do we deal with people with serious mental illness and other issues who are currently incarcerated, and are there some other models, anything along the spectrum from where we are now to outposted beds. I stumble over that because I'm just thinking about to places that are not within the jail, but potentially locked facilities, to within a hospital, to what Mark Anthony was talking about. So we're at the beginning of really trying to do a very, very deep dive into understanding what the options are, who our population looks like, what would be suitable for them. And that's why I say we have a ton to learn, and not everything is pinned on just one study, multiple work streams. The intersection of sort of all our work is critical in figuring out the work forward.
So Homer, what are your concerns, if any, about outposting beds to a hospital-like facility that is still run by criminal justice?
I think that we have a lot to learn from reforms and innovations that have occurred with drug courts. So that's an example of something where, you know, we have almost every county, and we have over 2,000 drug courts around the country. Those are efforts to get people into a more treatment-based pathway. But what we've built in many of these places is, you know, like 1,000 swords of Damocles that dangle over the person as they're given this like precious access to the treatment that they didn't get in the community. And then any little hitch, right, a positive drug screen or a problem or lateness with an encounter, boom, one of those swords falls down on them and they're back into the jail. So we've just built these pipelines that lead people back to the same places. So, you know, in thinking, I've been part of lots of efforts over the years to develop more humane, more evidence-based outposting places for jail patients to receive their care, and they generally bring better outcomes. I think, though, this is a time for us to have we should agree or not agree on some guiding principles. And we should stop and say, do we agree that if a health problem led to your interaction with law enforcement, the solution should be a health solution, and that should be disconnected as much as we can with justice and law enforcement. And so if we agree on that, then that's what we should build. Because my experience in building, you know, new units in jails, new units that are connected to jails but outside the physical confines of the jail, is that those actually end up being incredibly expensive and incredibly complicated. It doesn't mean that those don't have virtue, but I think that we should stop and agree. To Liz's point, do we agree on a couple, like 2 or 3 guiding principles right now or not? And if we do, then our efforts should be most focused on pursuit of those principles.
I think Dr. Geller has a question he'd like to ask.
Yeah, Mark Anthony, you know, the details are the details. And I'm interested in, if you were to execute the model, where you're going to get the workforce from. It sounds good to say we're going to move this over to the LA Department of Mental Health, but the LA Department of Mental Health can't do what it's already tasked to do. How's it going to do more? The LA Department of Mental Health has a permanent ad in the APA newspaper, Psychiatric News, trying to recruit psychiatrists. If you move from Boston to LA, and I picked Boston because the cost of living is fairly comparable. It's not like moving from Kansas to LA. The day you show up, you can double your salary and cut by 50% the number of years you have to serve to qualify for state pension. And they can't get psychiatrists to move. So where are you going to get the workforce unless you put into that bill some way that the county is going to provide educational loans or some way to increase increase the workforce to be deployed to all these centers? How are you going to do it?
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's a great question. I think, so there's a couple things. One is, I think we have to talk about, in addition to what Homer was saying around building this infrastructure, how do we transition folks into more of this health-focused work, right? And so one of the things that we saw in Los Angeles is that probably about 5-6 years ago now, the LA Sheriff's Department was the largest employer of psychiatrists in LA County. And that led to tremendous problems. And so they transitioned that and made sure that jail mental health was now Department of Health Services. And so one of the things that they started doing is paying off student loans for healthcare providers that decide to work in the jails. And I think those things are interesting because I think what they're trying to do is build the workforce. They're trying to build and recruit more folks to do that work. At the same time, we have to figure out how do we do it on the outside. DMH, you're right. There's a lot of questions around DMH's capacity. I don't feel qualified to answer that question, but I feel very much invested in the expansion of the infrastructure, and so I think we need to figure it out. DMH in Los Angeles is coming from a really long and terrible history of allowing folks to be neglected inside of the jails, of allowing people to die inside of the jails. And I think there's some serious changes that are going to be made, and I'm encouraged by the current leadership inside of DMH, folks who I know, both like John Sharon, for example, who's looking at community-based treatment, is looking at international models such as the Trieste model in Italy, things like that, where folks are thinking way outside the box, and how can we do this in a way that actually brings more resources to our folks. And so yes, the question of building the workforce is really important, and I think my role as an advocate has been to really substantiate the arguments that we're making and look at other models to really make that happen.
Dr. Ford?
Yeah, it is challenging to recruit mental health professionals, particularly psychiatrists, into jails and prisons or any space where people who have an incarceration history are treated. So I get that. I think it's important for the group to know that it is not a requirement of a psychiatric residency in this country that you have any exposure to anybody with criminal justice history, either in or out. It's not a standard requirement of training, which to me is a public health tragedy, and I think speaks also to why it's hard for us to get people to work in the settings. It's very much, speaking as a psychiatrist and those I work with, your choice of career is based in large part on what you're exposed to during your training. And if you're not even given the opportunity to learn whether you like or don't like something, you know, you're selling yourself short. I do think there are, so repaying student loans, very important. There are a lot, at least here in New York, it appears that there are a lot of people exiting residency, psychiatrists, who are very mission-driven and very public health conscious and really want to do, they want to work with this population in whatever way they can. It is correct also that in this country there's a shortage of psychiatrists, and it's very expensive, and there are sort of practical quality of life things that need to be overcome. And I am sure Dr. Geller wants to say something.
And before you do, I just want to say, I have you know, lawyers now have a requirement that we have to do a certain amount of pro bono hours if you're younger than me. But the younger ones coming up have to do that. And when I've raised this with doctors and say, well, how come you doctors don't have to do some pro bono? The response is uniformly, you know, no, we already do enough, and I appreciate that. But so while you're responding to Dr. Ford's suggestion about having some kind of requirement to have that as part of your training, that exposure, can you also talk about that idea about why don't you do some pro bono with work?
Sure. So I did want to point out that we have to understand the serious individuals with serious mental illness in jails and prisons, and individuals with serious mental illness in America. So the comment that Los Angeles County has a long and checkered history of dealing with serious mental illness in jails is contextualized by the fact that the county has a long and checkered history of dealing with people with serious mental illness everywhere. The fact that residency training does not require an experience in the criminal justice system. In fact, in the United States today, you can get through your residency training program and never have to talk to a person or evaluate a person that has serious mental illness at all. So these are fundamental problems that get played out in jails and prisons, but some part of that is that they're getting played out every place else. Pro bono work. The problem with an analogy to an attorney is if I am go to college and I graduate and I go to law school, I'm finished in 3 years. I go out and practice. In medicine, I go to undergraduate school, then I go to medical school for 4 years, then I go to a residency that's anywhere from 4 to 8 years, then I'm ready to practice. I have, just from medical school, I could easily have student loans between $300,000 and $400,000. That's just from the 4 years of medical school. They can't afford to go out and practice. In fact, they can't afford to become psychiatrists, which is part of the workforce issue. I have a son who just became a cardiologist. First job out of training, it's a long training, that was 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, and 4 years of fellowship before he could practice. His salary, first year out of training, is double the mean salary of every psychiatrist in the United States. So if we're going to have a workforce, we have to address those problems. And if we're going to effectively deal with people with serious mental illness in jails and prisons, it's not going to happen unless we effectively deal with people with serious mental illness wherever they are. Can I just go on to another point?
Yeah.
Okay. So what could you do today? You can. So one of the questions is, what's the AP doing? APA doing, you know, we got accused of paying no attention for decades. So the APA is very legislatively active. And here's a couple of things that are happening right now that you could actually do something about. One is the reintroduction of a bill that was introduced last year, and it's going to be reintroduced by Congressman Paul Tonko. Does anybody live in his district? He's a New York State Congressman? Upstate? I think somebody from upstate could come to New York City. And this is that individuals in jails and prisons would become Medicaid eligible 30 days before they left the facility. So, right to Congressman Tonko, it's going to be reintroduced. The second bill, which was introduced right at the end of the last congressional setting that APA is pushing for, which in last session was HR 6764, would make somebody eligible for Medicaid the entire time they're in jail or prison. That is, being in jail or prison is not an exclusion from Medicaid, and then the jail or prison would bill Medicaid for any of the medical or psychiatric services that the person received in jail or prison. Just two more. One is a funding letter for the Mentally Ill Offenders Treatment Crime Reduction Act that provides grants to law enforcement and the mental health community to collaborate together for improvement in the criminal justice system. And last is refunding of crisis services, again for the diversion of the seriously mentally ill population from jails and prisons. So these are all ongoing right now in terms of federal legislation, and you should be pushing your congressmen and senators.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that this, you know, in 1965, the Social Security Act actually did affirmatively exclude inmates from use of federal funds behind bars. And so it's called the inmate exclusion. And what it says is, and this is, you know, more than 10 years before Estelle v. Gamble, the Supreme Court case that said everybody who's an inmate should get some health care. First, we said they definitely aren't going to get it using any of our federal funds or oversight or quality tools. Then later on, we said, you know, they should get it. And so what's evolved or devolved over many, many decades is that they're getting care, the quality of which is determined by a sheriff or a Department of Correction, often delivered by for-profit vendors or local public institutions that are not really doing the same kind of quality of work that they would do in the community. I think that undoing that is important, and so there are our work at Coaches, there are elements of the opioid bundle, recently passed a federal, the First Step Act. There are local legislations that are being contemplated around the country, for instance, to guarantee access to MAT, medication-assisted therapy. That could help us crack open this 30-day window. It should be the whole time you're there. But the reason that, if you look at the 3,000 jails around the country, you have such low-quality care provided at such a very low cost, it's because we've carved it out. And so one of our core objectives should be to undo that, to connect this care to the community. Local legislation is important, but we have to also have a principled discussion of, do we really think that in 2019, all of this care, the quality of it, the accounting for if it was provided ethically and in a financially responsible manner, should be even left to county by county or even state by state? Because that's not what happens to the rest of your health care. You know, I think it's an important, and I'm glad you underscored this, you can't use federal funds except for very limited aspects. If somebody goes to the hospital for more than 24 hours, sure, that hospital could, you know, there's a transfer of status, somebody can get, there's reimbursable care that can happen in the hospital. But those county jails and those state prisons, they're reacting to a system that we allowed to devolve.
So I just wanted to respond again to contextualize this. The Social Security Administration did not just pick out and pick on people in jails and prisons. Anybody in an institution got no Medicare and Medicaid, and an institution was defined as over 16 beds, and the primary diagnosis was psychiatric, you didn't get Medicaid. Now that's slowly changing. So actually, the federal agency that's most responsible for where people are with serious mental illness today is CMS. Right? Medicaid has been driving this system since the Johnson administration. And if any of you are history buffs, and you want to know which president is responsible for the mess we're in now, does anybody know which president is responsible for the mess we're in now? Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce. Some of you don't even know he was a president. Franklin Pierce vetoed a bill in 1854 that would have made the federal government responsible for everybody in this country with serious mental illness. And the reason he did it in 1854 was he said, it's already the state's historic responsibility. Why would the federal government take this on? And perish the thought, if the federal government took on the responsibility for poor people with serious mental illness, somebody would come up with the idea that the federal government should be responsible for all poor people. Then where would this country be? And we didn't address that question for over 100 years. We really didn't address it until the Johnson administration. And then the whole issue was it was going to cost the federal government too much money if they take on this same historic responsibility, so we're going to cut them right out. So it was jails and prisons, psychiatric hospitals, public psychiatric hospitals, freestanding private psychiatric hospitals. And that's why, in my opinion, we pushed all the people out of state institutions. Right? In New York State, if John Doe is in a state institution, it costs New York State $1 for every dollar of care. If John Doe's in the community, it costs New York State 50 cents for every dollar. So anybody would think, we'll get them out, then we'll figure out what to do with them after we get them out. Where do they end up? Many of them in jails and prisons. Yeah.
So we're going to start with questions, but I just want to follow up on your point, and the provision you're talking about is the so-called IMD exclusion, and it is the only provision in Social Security that I'm aware of that discriminates against poor people based on where their illness is. So if they have brain cancer, they can find a doctor. If they have schizophrenia, you know, they can't because of this IMD. So yeah, we need to, as you're putting in plugs to have people work on issues, that's one we need to have people work on. So Liz Glazer has to leave. Thank you, Liz. Your mic. Yeah. Oh, you put it there. Okay, last time you didn't. Okay, thanks, Liz. So Anna. Oh, there you are. You have the microphone? Okay. So if we have any questions from the audience, we have about a half an hour left. We wanted to give time for questions. And Anna will come around with the microphone, and you can ask questions. So I think you had your hand up first. Victoria, right? No? Valentia. Can you go over there, please? And then it'll come to you, Liz.
Thanks so much. My question is, I've noticed in these panels that kind of conspicuously absent are advocates in the recovery movement with lived experience. And I'm wondering if you all are soliciting their feedback with respect to either new designs for programming or current treatment models within the jail. And I mean, just generally speaking, like the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery or the National Empowerment Center, because it seems like to leave those folks out of this conversation would be a really grave mistake. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. We do certainly check in with people with lived experience in our development of Hope House, for example. But I think you're right. We do need, if we're going to do more of these panels, we do need to engage the population more, and we will. So thanks for bringing it up. I appreciate it. Liz.
With all due respect to psychiatrists, and I know we need them to write prescriptions, it would seem to me like in the rest of the world where there's a shortage of physicians, like they have nurse midwives and nurses and social workers that are doing an enormous amount of the work in other medical fields. I would assume that it would be possible to build a workforce in which, yes, of course, there would be psychiatrists. I've always found them personally helpful, but in general, I would think that we could be doing a lot more with other, including people with lived experience, of building a workforce that is not 100% dependent on the medical profession. We've certainly done that in other aspects of criminal justice quite successfully. And I'm wondering, wouldn't that be less expensive? Wouldn't it be easier to create new credentials that would be possible for people to be able to be staffing these non-jail facilities?
So in point of fact, the non-physician workforce in psychiatry is larger than any workforce in any other field in medicine. There are nurse practitioners, certified nurse specialists, physician's assistants. There are specifically psychiatrically trained social workers. There's a huge number of psychologists. That workforce is not the problem. The problem really is the shortage of psychiatrists, because all those different disciplines, I mean, the ideal is they all work as a team, and the team doesn't function very well if it doesn't have a psychiatrist. So that's not the psychiatrist. I mean, if we look at this, it's the same model as Assertive Community Treatment Act, which is pervasive in New York City. There's a psychiatrist that's part of that team. Doesn't have to be a full-time psychiatrist. It's usually a quarter-time psychiatrist. The team doesn't work terribly well, I think, if it's missing any of its members. I see you shrugging. But to answer your question, there is a pervasive cadre of non-physician workforce, and there's an extensive peer workforce. So in the hospital where I work, we have a department of peer services that's staffed only by people with lived experience. It's hard because many of them find it very difficult to work in facilities that they were once type of facility. They're not working in the same facility. And I would think it would be even harder to ask people to go back into a prison. But I would totally support that there should be a peer workforce. But that's not going to make up for a shortage of psychiatrists, in my opinion.
I just want to acknowledge your question and thank you for it. In the New York City jail system, the mental health service is 500 plus people, a small fraction of which are psychiatrists and physician extenders, so the NPs and the PAs. I do agree that psychiatry needs to be part of really any mental health team. The work, at least in our jail, is so much about engaging with the individual, not about their medication, but about whatever brought them in, whatever stresses they're facing, the reentry challenges, dealing with the other people in their housing area. I mean, there's so much that does not require a medical education. And I do think that your point is very important, that we need to build, the workforce isn't all psychiatry, although it is a critical part of it. And I just wanted to go back to Valentina's question about peers. I think people with lived experience and their voice in all of this is critical. It's been challenging in New York City because the security restrictions have been such that bringing in people who have been formerly incarcerated there to work is tough. We have used people who are currently, we talk to the patients who are currently incarcerated about how to better improve the programs that are in the jails now. And so we are trying as best we can to include that voice, but I think your point's important. Uh-oh, we got a follow-up.
Well, I just want to respond. The notion of just prescribing medication, one, is not what I think psychiatrists do.
Correct.
But second, I have a caseload in the state hospital, and our state hospital is 80+% forensic patients. One of the major functions that I perform is not prescribing medication. It's not prescribing medication. Mm-hmm. The major function is taking people off medications that they don't need. And very few folks, either mid-levels or physicians of other disciplines, are going to do that. If we had fewer psychiatrists and more others, we would have more people on more medications.
I get that, but if we don't have the psychiatrists, I just don't want that to stop the decisions that have to get made in Los Angeles and New York City, because we're not going to produce 1,000 psychiatrists in New York City or Los Angeles in the next 4 years, are we?
Well, I don't think it's going to stop it. But while it's ongoing, I think you need to simultaneously improve the workforce.
Joanne.
I'll get you back there. I think I'm somewhere in the same neighborhood, but I want to make the neighborhood a little bit larger. I think that if we stay within our current parameters, we're going to keep what we've got. And what I heard about LA is about trying to expand those parameters and go for, if you will, the low-hanging fruit as opposed to start with the intractable places. What we know, speaking of Rikers, is that it's like a trauma sausage factory, right? Mm-hmm. If we reduced the amount of trauma that we spent a lot of money creating, we would have fewer people. I found what you said, Dr. Ford, fascinating about people who get defined as being unreachable because of personality disorder, being people who've been repeatedly traumatized. And if you simply treat them like people and create a non-traumatic situation, there's a healing that happens. Mm-hmm. And at Fortune Society, we're housing people who are seriously mentally ill in the midst of a population that isn't, with role modeling by people who've been in the same problems that they've been in, and with the mental health piece, including a psychiatrist. But the psychiatrist is just a tiny corner of it. And I think if we expanded the circle a little more broadly, and we said, what does it take to create a healing community that includes mental health services? We're in a different world. The other thing is, where are our trauma sausage factories? And what do we do about them? And when I think of the people who walk through our doors, we have what we call system babies, who came out of abusive homes into abusive institutional care, into abusive juvenile facilities, into abusive adult facilities. And people stun me by their pull toward health. Despite all of that, how do we support that? I think if we don't start with a you are wrong and there's something bad about you, but we start with, my God, you've lived through hell. What are your strengths? How can we surround you by people who feed hope? That's not a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a core part, but I think a very small part of the larger. And what we've seen at Rikers, and I'm talking about decades of working there, is it's getting harder and harder and harder and harder to get anybody with a criminal justice history in. And that's a huge loss.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm going to go in the back, the woman in the black. Yep. And then I'll go over here, too.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm very interested in this. My name is Mary Buser. I worked in the mental health department in Rikers Island pretty much through the 90s, leaving in 2000. And this is such an important discussion. I have a big concern, though, that really hasn't been addressed. Maybe Cheryl alluded to it a little in the beginning. I believe last week the city, there was news that they're looking to identify places to put the mentally ill population off Rikers Island, kind of this uncoupling. And I'm very concerned because it really looks to me as if it is the Rikers model all over again. We're taking the mental observation units out of the jails and moving them, yes, out into the community, but it's all still under the umbrella of the Department of Correction. People will still be an inmate first, a patient second. They will still have to go through the trauma of arrest. They will still be on the count, being counted every day. And I really hoped that with this important juncture where we are with closing Rikers, that we would get some real change. And, you know, when I was at Rikers, we would go to the receiving rooms every day to see people who were the people you see in the subways, very decompensated, to make a judgment, should they go into population or an MO, a mental observation unit. And it struck me that these were the very people who would have been in those big hospitals had they not been shut down. Right. And they should have been shut down, but the promise was that they would be replaced with community treatment. It never materialized. And I feel like here we are again, maybe at a chance, a juncture to have that come about, and why aren't we pushing for that? And it's not only for the, just that it's terrible to be treating mentally ill people in jail, but it's also for larger community safety. I was in the Anna Cross Center when Andrew Goldstein was brought in after he had the horrible incident of pushing Kendra Webdale into the subways, into subway tracks. And it is well documented that he had tried for years in the community to get help that wasn't available. The help became available after the fact and at the price of this woman's life.
Right.
So I guess my question is, why aren't we pushing for what really needs to be done, starting in the community, to treat people with severe and persistent mental illness?
Thank you.
And I don't know what the answer is.
Right, and I think that's what we did start out with that conversation at the beginning. And Dr. Ford, I don't know if I can have you respond generally about it, and then we're going to take a question over here.
So I agree with the comment about the community being responsible and taking responsibility. The question about what was printed in the paper and the solicitation that the city sent out, I can't really talk about that, and I would caution everybody to please, before you jump to conclusions about what you read in the New York Post, to just assume good intentions. And but everything is in such early phases of feasibility discussion. It is. I don't frankly think it's worth talking about it right at the moment.
So, in response, New York City ought to learn from New York State's experience. You have a great case you could look at. Pilgrim State Hospital once had 16,000 patients. What worked and what didn't work, because a lot of lessons could be learned right in your own neighborhood.
Okay, I think there was someone in the back there, in the very back. Yep.
Hi, I want to piggyback off of the lived experience comment. There's individuals with lived experience who believe that in trying to lessen the population on Rikers Island, if you go to the Medicare model, you would take the onus off the state for taking care of individuals who have mental illness, which it would include people who are currently incarcerated. But if you do that, the financial burden wouldn't be on the state anymore, and those individuals in the state keep people incarcerated for long periods of time, even though they're not a threat to society, even those with mental illnesses. And if they don't have, as the individuals get older, those individuals incur more physical disabilities, so they cost the state more in medical, in health-related issues. So if you take that away from the state, that onus in paying for them, those individuals fear they will languish in prison forever and not be let out. So if you try to fix the Rikers Island problem by going to the Medicaid, you can cause another problem by keeping people in prison longer. What do you have to say to that?
Does anyone want to take that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I will say that in talking about the adequacy of health services around the country, this has come up, that people don't want to create, and this is really an existential question, which is, should we improve conditions or provide humane health care and evidence-based health care behind bars, or should we simply try and get rid of everything? And so New York is a fantastic model for what I think the rest of the country is probably not even close to doing, which is if you cut the rate of incarceration more than in half, and you focus on creating great diversion pathways, fewer people in prison and in jail, what you can easily do is turn your back on the plight of people who still go behind bars. And so it is fantastic that we have under 8,000 people, and that many prison systems have decreased also their incarcerated rolls. But we must provide evidence-based and humane care for people who are incarcerated. And the reason actually I am a strong proponent of the use of Medicaid funds behind bars is not the funding, it's the oversight. It's that I do not want a commissioner of corrections to be the person who says, this is okay healthcare, this is not. That's what happens all over the country. And so healthcare systems everywhere in the community have to answer to healthcare experts who decide did they do a good job or a bad job. That should happen to everybody. That should be really a benefit that everybody gets who's detained, prison or jail or ICE detention for that matter. And that shouldn't keep us from also lowering the number of people who are detained. And New York City did one half of that quite well and still has much more to go. And it did not do the other half of it very well.
Homer, is anyone in other countries that has moved their criminal justice system to a point where mental health is overseeing?
Well, I think that, I was on a panel once where somebody asked, we were talking about dual loyalty, this very pervasive problem we haven't even talked about, which is that you think you have a doctor or a nurse or a social worker behind bars. More often than not, what happens to us over time is we end up working as agents of the security service, despite our best intent, because we're human, right? And that systematic problem we don't talk about. We haven't talked about it here. We're not talking about it anywhere in the country except for hopefully still at Rikers or in the New York City jail system. But in a panel about how long is too long, a colleague from the UK said, we would never even have this model because we have a public health service, a national health service. Everybody who works inside works outside, and they bring their standards and their commitment to their patients inside. Now that's tough to do. Rates of incarceration are obviously much lower in Europe, and I think Vera has done an amazing job of taking some of the learnings of those institutions and bringing it, but they don't view, most of the European countries that I'm familiar with, they don't view healthcare behind bars as separate than healthcare in the community. And I think that's this fundamental principle we have to agree or disagree on.
Yeah.
Just a quick response to that. The APA had convened a panel. They're going to have some webinars. And the panel was psychiatrists who work in correctional settings. To follow up on Homer's point, their ideal model was that a psychiatrist should spend 25% of their work week in a correctional setting, which might be one way to address some of the workforce issues in correctional settings. But that's what they thought was the ideal.
Thanks. Ken?
Thank you. To address the point made by individual back there somewhere about a different model whereby it's still a jail, even though it's a community-based jail under the Department of Corrections. We are seeing some models around the country in Texas and in Florida and in Maryland where the concept is a 3-door jail where, working in conjunction with the police, individuals are brought to this facility and there are 3 doors that they might go through. One is diversion, which is New York City is doing, and there's a magistrate in the building, and there's probation in the building. The second door is detention, and that's the standard if there's criminality and without other circumstances, that individual is detained for court appearance. The third door is the deflection door into the mental health or support system. And there will be other And so you're screened at the point of entry. The police agree not to make a charge until that screening is done. It's pretty complicated, but it's working. And so it's a totally different concept. So one of our clients in Maryland, instead of having a 200-bed jail, by using this model, is only going to have 80 secure beds, and the other, and with a crisis center and a magistrate's court in the building. So this monolithic approach of large cities taking a huge system and breaking it into simply gigantic pieces still doesn't get us there. So the three-door jail is a kind of conceptual way. Well, it's more than conceptual, it's actually operational now in a number of counties.
So maybe something to take back to LA, that concept, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, can y'all hear me? I mean, I definitely share the concerns around that are being named in this conversation. I think part of what my hope is and my commitment is right now is that if we're going to say that we believe in diversion and we believe in care, not cages, we believe in treatment first, then I think instead of building a three-door jail, build what you're going to divert people to, right? Don't take folks to the jail, right? One of the things that's happening in Los Angeles County is they're investing in urgent care centers, right? And these urgent care centers are supposed to be able to divert up to 10,000 people a year by the county's initial assessments. That's an equivalent to the sheriff stopping arrests for about a month, right? Those are the types of calculations I think we need to have and we need to be thinking about. And what is and instead of using the jails as a middle way to get people to treatment, one, reduce police contact, and then instead of taking folks to the jail, get them directly to the care and services they need.
Can you there are some states that de facto do that by using their evaluation for competency to stand trial as that mechanism. So you're in court, they do an evaluation. They could answer the question, but they don't answer the question because the person really needs psychiatric treatment, and then they send him to the state hospital for 20 days for an evaluation, which is really 20 days to stabilize them. Often then the charges are dropped. I'm not an advocate of that system. I'm just saying that's the way it happens.
Okay, I'm going to go to the gentleman behind you, Anna, and then we're going to come over here.
Hi, Jamil Hamilton, Manager of Public Policy and Advocacy at National Alliance of Mental Illness, New York City. I have a question specifically for Mark Anthony. I'm really interested in how did you get policymakers and electeds to, one, hear and understand the needs and goals of your campaign, and then two, get these policymakers and electeds to start supporting your goals and become partners for change? And it's open to anyone, but I think, Mark, I'm really interested in your examples.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think it's a lot of things, a lot of patience, a lot of rigor. For everything that we demanded, we researched and provided a lot of analysis behind. And I think part of the way we did this, it was in a multi-phase approach, right? We built a very broad coalition. And when I say broad, I mean folks who didn't politically agree with us or maybe politically have our same end game, right? But we believed had an interest in stopping the jail. And I think it was really critical for us to make sure that we were having those relationships, maintaining those relationships, because the goal of political struggle, it really comes down to who can maintain the strongest coalition and who can peel off the other person's coalition more effectively. And so for us, we really made sure that our coalition was broad and wide enough to launch this effort over the last 8 years. The other thing I would say is we operated in multiple fronts. This wasn't just a campaign to stop jail construction. It was also a campaign for pretrial reform. It was also a campaign for building alternatives to incarceration, right? And I think and it was also a legislative campaign. One of the things that happened after we lost in 2016 is, one of our county supervisors said, look, the only way you're going to stop this thing is if you sue us or you get this thing on the ballot. So we were like, okay, cool. So then we were able to raise the funds and pull it together. So now what we did is we actually collected enough signatures so that in 2020, the county voters would actually vote and go around the supervisors who thankfully they got their act together, but in 2020 would vote on where that money was gonna go and actually creating a body that would decide how to divert those $4 billion. The other thing is like really important is really having and centering directly impacted voices and making those voices absolutely unable to block those voices out. And really centering that the whole time, centering that in our meetings, in our conversations with the supervisors, I think has been really critical. Particularly in a county like Los Angeles that oftentimes presents itself as progressive, but was operating from a really frustrating political dissonance. You had a county board of supervisors that all agreed that the worst place for people with mental health conditions to be was in a jail. You had a DOJ that said that the jails was producing suicidality. You had a sheriff that said the worst place for people to be in the county jails was, with mental health conditions was in the county jails, right? And yet the fight was against stopping the county from pushing forward with this $1 billion jail plan. And so we not only moved on those fronts, but we also actually changed the landscape. And in addition to the things I named, really going after the sheriff. One thing that doesn't happen in Los Angeles is sheriffs being ousted out of their seats via the ballot box. And post the retirement of Sheriff Baca, after a host of scandals for covering up jail abuse, Sheriff McDonald came in, and he was touted as a reformed sheriff, made several moves. Some were good, some were bad. And part of what we did is we changed the political climate so that he had to actually confront a lot of the issues that were in the jails. We had won a civilian oversight commission of the sheriff's department. And one of the things is we did, we used that to really elevate a lot of the critical issues, like the sheriff collaborating with ICE and facilitating deportations, suicides inside the jails, those type of things. So that the next election came up and his opponent actually ran on a platform against jail construction, against ICE collaboration, right? And I think that was really important because it changed the climate. And he won. And the fact that a sheriff was ousted and that Sheriff Villanueva was voted in, that hasn't happened in the last 105 years in LA County. It's because the political climate was changed. And so we weren't just going after our targets, which was the County Board of Supervisors, but we were changing the landscape in which they had to operate. Right? And so then the sheriff, after he won, came to us and said, look, I'm against this jail. Who do I need to invest in? Who do I need to tell the supervisors this is where you need to put diversion money towards? And so we went out, talked to all the community-based providers that we could find and asked them, how many people do you serve? If you had $4 billion, how could you scale up? What would the impact be, right? And started to calculate those numbers and put it forward to the sheriff, right? And so I say all that to say that, yes, it was about directly pushing them, substantiating our analysis, but also changing the landscape and the political climate in which they had to respond to that created this opening for us to win.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. Alyssa, you want to ask a quick question? We have about 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Katz. I'm deputy editor of The City, which is a new forthcoming nonprofit news venture, and we were the ones who broke the news last week of Liz Glazer's office exploring alternative locations and oversight for inmates with serious mental illness, possibly at hospitals. And relating to that, she said something else very interesting, which is that it's very important, generally speaking, to get buy-in from judges and from prosecutors about policy. And that may open the door, certainly opens the door to my question about if we are looking at those units potentially as being alternatives to incarceration instead of being just Rikers Island but in another location, what would you hope that judges and prosecutors understand about psychiatric treatment and about treatment goals and about what realistically can happen in that opportunity to really make those alternative units viable alternatives to incarceration instead of mini jails?
Go ahead.
I'll take it.
Yes.
Sure. So without delving into the discussion about the proposal, I do think it's critically important that judges, frankly, everyone in the legal system understands, actually that we all understand, that mental illness and serious mental illness is a whole range and represents a population of individuals who are fully autonomous and can take care of themselves and are well treated to those who really need to be in a hospital and are not doing as well. And I think when we have to, I do feel strongly we have to be cautious about conversations where we are too generalizing the population too much and not thinking about multiple different pathways for the multiple different kinds of people who are coming through the system. I do think that judges generally tend to see people with serious mental illness as more violent than they are. And certainly with respect to medication-assisted treatment and treatment for substance use, there is a pull towards a requirement for residential housing in order to go along with that kind of, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So I think trying to be more tailored to the person in front of you, to the defendant in front of you and what their needs are, and that requires a lot more community engagement, a lot more very quick upfront assessment. The idea about the third door, sorry, I'm just going to answer or to discuss that. I agree, I don't love the idea of it going into the jail, but the idea of deferring charges so that one could actually be assessed is not something that we do well in New York City at all, but would very clearly, in my mind, address what I think is the worst problem, which is people entering the jail. Because once you are in the criminal justice system, it is just very hard to get out.
Yeah. Okay,
yes,
well, unfortunately, yeah.
Just really quickly.
Yes, very quickly, because
my hope, and this is why I did the work around building with healthcare providers, is that we can help judges understand their role, not just in this question of punishment, but also in the question of health. And for me, particularly around the work around pretrial reform, my assessment is that there's not one health mission, concern, priority that one might have that isn't significantly undermined by pretrial detention. And we've seen this in Los Angeles County. People are going in, it interrupts the continuum of care. They're going out, they're coming out with high blood pressure, they're coming out suicide, they're coming out with all the things. And so really helping judges understand, you're not just sentencing people to time, you are sentencing people to diagnoses. Yeah, and that is a really critical shift. And I think we have an opportunity to really change the way in which judges think about some of these things when we look at the whole impact that is necessary. And my hope is that in this moment in Los Angeles, we can get more judges to do the type of piloting that I mentioned earlier, invest in it, and protect it when that blowback comes, that we know it eventually comes.
So I want to thank our panelists on behalf of the Greenburger Center. I feel like we're just so honored to have you all. I think it's been a great conversation, and I hope we continue. And next time we will have some people with lived experience. So thanks for coming. We appreciate it.